In Fear Factor, Abigail Marsh records using an fMRI to discover what happens when in the brain to make some people respond empathetically to the fear of others, while some remain indifferent. The answer, published here for the first time, lies in the amygdala, which controls the response to and memory of the emotions, especially fear. Combining her lab work with stories of both actual heroes and psychopathic patients, Marsh brings the science to life and shows how the amygdala affects everyday behavior. Catherine Himes of Science magazine said, "Those who seek to comprehend the origin of fear, altruism, and elements of human nature will find this book a key factor in their increased understanding." Marsh is an associate professor of psychology at Georgetown, directs the university's laboratory on social and affective neuroscience, which won the prestigious Cozzarelli Prize for its groundbreaking work on extraordinary altruism. She will be joined in conversation tonight with Barbara Bradley Hagerty, an award-winning NPR correspondent and the author of Life Reimagined. Please help me welcome them to Politics and Prose.
Good evening. Can everyone hear me? Is it high enough? Okay, great. Wonderful. Well, I first met Abby in 2013 when I was doing some research on altruism. In the course of our interview, I realized that Abby has a very wide range of interests in her research, from kind of Pollyanna to Hannibal Lecter, right? From generosity to psychopathy. And what's wonderful about Abby, what was wonderful for me as a journalist, is that she's got this happy combination of being a deeply rigorous scientist and also someone who can really make the science accessible and interesting to all of us. So, and her book is very much the same way. It is smart, it's insightful, it's fascinating, it's engaging, it's all those things. And so we're going to have a great conversation tonight. Let's just start with how you dived into the research. What attracted you to the research that led you to both kind of the light and the dark?
Well, the seeds of the research were planted a long time ago, 22 years ago, I think, at this point. With apologies to those of you who have already heard this story more than once. My interest in altruism and in what makes people care about the welfare of anybody else around them really spawned from a day when my life was saved by a stranger after a car accident in my hometown of Tacoma, Washington. Just in brief, that night I was driving home down the Interstate 5 freeway in Washington to my home when a little dog darted out in front of me. And for those of us dog lovers here, I did what any of us would have done, which you should not do. Consider this a public service announcement. Don't do it. Don't swerve to avoid hitting the dog, which is what I did, which sent my car spinning out across the freeway, finally landing in the fast lane of the freeway, facing backward into the oncoming traffic. And the force of the spinning out had caused the engine to die. And I was stranded with no exit, no cell phone. This was back in the 90s, and I was sure that I was going to die. The semis and cars streaming toward me were swerving barely in time to avoid me. And I don't know how long I sat there being sure that I was going to die, but until a man appeared at the passenger side window of the car and said, "You look like you could use some help." And I said, "Yes, I think I could." And he ran around the car, got it running again. It had been still in drive, which is why I wouldn't go, and got us back across the freeway to safety. And then pretty much disappeared. He said, "You're going to be all right? Do you need me to follow you for a little bit? You're going to be able to get home?" I said, I'm okay. I wasn't. And he said, "All right, you take care of yourself." And then he drove away. I didn't know his name. I'm pretty sure I forgot to say thank you. And it's all well and good to know that in theory people help other people and that even people might make huge sacrifices to help other people, but there's nothing like having it happen to you to make it real and to bring the real mystery of humans caring for others alive. And so it really, that question rooted itself in my brain, and I think has really been the impetus for a lot of the research that's followed.
So we can't know exactly what was going on in that man's brain, but except for good thoughts, helpful thoughts. But how does altruism work in the brain? What's the mechanism? Why are some people more altruistic than others?
So we're very much still on our way to trying to answer that question. It's a question that people have been trying to answer for a while, bedeviled by the problem of the fact that altruism is behavior that's intended to help somebody else who's suffering or in distress. And so to try to model it in the lab requires causing somebody to be suffering or in distress, and which is, deeply unethical, and there's no university IRB that would approve of this, as my students who are here know. And so what we did instead was take a clinical approach to the problem, which is find people who do things that are altruistic out in the real world, bring them into the lab, and try to see what might be different about them in the lab using the tools that we have available to us. The root of what we found is that altruism seems to be motivated by partly things that are happening inside the amygdala, which is a structure in the brain that's involved in lots of social and emotional processes. And just in brief, what we found in people who were very altruistic, and in particular we studied people who had donated a kidney to a stranger. I think there might be one or two of them here today, I hope. In people who've donated a kidney to a stranger, the structure is larger than it is in the average person, and it's more active in response to the sight of another person in distress, and particularly somebody else who's frightened, which suggests that they may have a stronger empathic response to other people's distress, particularly fear, which may be what motivates them to help.
What were those? We've talked a little bit about the kidney donors. How did they present differently? Were they kind of more obviously generous as well?
In sort of the general walks of life and other domains, sure, absolutely. What's interesting about people who have donated kidneys to strangers, which again is the altruistic group that I have worked with, is that there's nothing obviously different about them compared to anybody else. You wouldn't necessarily know it about somebody when you first meet them, although there is a sense of, as my students and I have talked about a lot, of being treated as a friend very quickly rather than having a protracted warming up period or sort of a more closed experience at first. But it is true that people who donate kidneys to strangers are altruistic in many other ways besides that. They tend to donate blood. They often are involved in charitable work, like working for hospices or taking in foster children. It's really an amazing array of things.
And I remember you saying that the kidney donors didn't think of themselves as generous, whereas the people you had to kind of, other people who might donate kidneys for their family, it was a harder lift for them.
This is true. So among the many altruistic kidney donors I've worked with, many of them also know people who've donated to family members. And what has surprised them is that people who donate kidneys to friends and family members, which in some ways seems like the more obvious decision, often report having had to really hem and haw, and it took a long time to decide whether or not to do this. Whereas people who donate kidneys to strangers often report that the decision to donate was essentially instantaneous. They heard that kidney disease is the 9th leading cause of death in the United States, what an enormous number of people ultimately die on dialysis because it takes so long to get a kidney. And they hear this, and they hear that it is possible to donate a kidney to a stranger. We can live fine with one kidney. And it's just like that. They decide, all right, I'll do it, I'll donate.
That really does suggest there's a difference, a neurological difference, right? I mean,
yeah, I think that's really compelling evidence that whatever is driving the decision they're making is really deep-seated in the brain. It's not sort of a protracted, conscious sort of weighing of costs and benefits. And the amygdala is deep down in the brain, so it supports that it's helping make that decision.
So, are there differences? Why are there differences in generosity, say, between gender, nations, animals? I mean, are women better than men? Are some countries better than other countries? Are some animals better than other animals?
Absolutely. This is one of the things that really became the focus of my work, is how there's really a continuum of caring, certain among humans, where some people are at the very far end of the continuum, have a huge amount of caring for other people. Most of us are somewhere in the middle, and then there are some people down at the other end who don't seem to care about others at all. When it comes to big demographic differences, I don't see much of a difference between men and women, interestingly, in terms of how altruistic they are towards strangers. A few more women than men donate kidneys to strangers, but the proportions are like 55-45. It's not a huge difference. We do see altruism towards strangers increase, as you know, in middle age. So quite a few of our altruists are in their 40s, 50s, and 60s.
And what do you think that is?
That's a great question. It may have something to do with this sort of increased, I don't know, sense of satisfaction that arises as one has sort of accomplished the things you've been looking to accomplish as life progresses. It may have to do with really deep-seated issues in the brain that we have not identified yet. It's a great question. We also have identified in the course of the work we've done that if you look across geographic areas, you do see a correlation between altruism towards strangers in particular, so not altruism towards close friends and family, but towards people you've never met, and variables like prosperity and well-being and flourishing, where it seems to be the case that within states in the US and also within nations around the world, as people become better off, healthier, more educated, more literate, et cetera, altruism towards strangers in particular tends to go up and up and up, which is sort of an interesting and I think really optimistic finding, because we know that wealth and education and prosperity are continuing to rise. So thank goodness that's not inevitably associated with some sort of huge drop in altruism and caring.
How about animals?
So I've looked, I love animal research. I would have happily written an entire book about just animal behavior. But you know, as fate would have it, I don't actually do animal research, so I included my own research in there as well. Yeah, so there's big differences in animals and the extent to which they will care for anybody who's not directly related to them.
You call it allomothering? Is that what it's called?
Exactly.
Okay.
So there's this really cool phenomenon called allomothering, which just means taking care of babies that are not your own. And all mammals have some capacity to care because they have to care for their babies. And this is the essential requirement for mammals to even survive as species. But in some species, there seems to have been this kind of unlocking of the potential to care, so that mothers of some species, rats are among them. Rats are actually an incredibly altruistic species, believe it or not. Lions are an incredibly altruistic species, believe it or not. They can be extremely aggressive and I suppose cruel, you could call it, but they also do this amazing thing, which is taking care of babies that are not their own within the pride. And it seems to be the case, if you look across species, that those species where adults take care of babies that are not their own are also the most altruistic. And this really seems to support the idea that all altruism sort of emerged from the ability for parents to care for their children. And when that capacity sort of explodes upwards and outwards, altruism can flourish.
And where do humans rank?
We rank really high. We are some of the best altruism, we are some of the best allomothers around. Among primates, we're the most allomothering species. Other great apes actually don't do a lot of allomothering. Some that do are, for example, tamarins and marmosets. And if you look across primate species, the ones that allomother the most are also the most altruistic towards strangers, and humans are at the top of both lists. Around the world, it's actually really unnatural for babies to be taken care of only by their own mother. And I find this is a very strange and certainly incorrect belief in the modern world that a baby must spend the maximum amount of time with its own mother to be maximally healthy, because that's not the way any other culture does it. Most cultures around the world, especially if you look at hunter-gatherer cultures, babies are taken care of by dozens of people over the course of a week or even a day. They're nursed by people who are not their own mothers. They're handled by lots of people. And if you think about it, it really allows babies to learn that you can trust people. You can form loving bonds with people who are not just one single source of attachment.
So you kind of alluded to this a little bit earlier, but are we as a nation getting more altruistic? Because, you know, you read the paper and it feels like we're getting more tribal. So what's going on?
We are getting more tribal. There's no doubt about it. And what's really interesting is we know that tribalism is not helpful when it comes to altruism. We tend to treat people that we view as members of an out-group much worse than people who are members of an in-group. But at least when we're talking about altruism towards strangers who are sort of unmarked by a tribal identity, just an anonymous stranger somewhere in the world, we are getting more and more altruistic, without a doubt. Every year, if you look at the trends of charitable giving, volunteering, blood donation, bone marrow donation, kidney donation, all the lines are going up and up over time. It's actually pretty amazing. And of course, it's not really ever covered in the media because that's not sensational, that's not fascinating. But it really is. Doing the research for this book made me more optimistic than I'd felt in a long time.
Well, let's just shift from optimism to Hannibal Lecter now, if we may, which
course.
is really, really, really interesting. Tell us a little bit about how psychopathy works in the brain.
So psychopathy you can think of as kind of lying at the other end of the caring continuum. And so while it is true that humans seem to be endowed with the capacity for care as a result of having these needy babies we have to take care of, any human capacity can go awry during development. And psychopathy is a developmental disorder that seems to be at least in partly related to genetic problems, not completely, but in part. That seems to result in people having no capacity to care for anybody but themselves. And it is something that occurs in a severe form in about 1 or 2% of the population. And what we discovered is that people who are psychopathic have brains that look sort of the opposite of people who are very altruistic. So where altruists have, for example, amygdalas that are larger and more active than average, people who are psychopathic have the opposite. Their amygdalas are smaller than average and also less active.
So and the title of your book is about the fear factor. What role does fear, or the ability, the capacity to recognize fear in others, what role does that have in psychopathy?
So one of the things that's been observed about psychopathy from the very beginning, and it's been researched scientifically for maybe 60 or 70 years now, is that people who are psychopathic tend to have sort of a fearless, bold personality. They're not susceptible to punishment. They don't respond to things that are threatening very strongly. And this is one of the reasons that people who are psychopathic tend to offend and reoffend over and over again, because the way that punishment is supposed to work is that if you fear getting punished, you won't do the thing that will result in the punishment. And it doesn't seem to be the case that people who are psychopathic have that response. And so for a long time, it was suspected that something must be wrong in their amygdalas, because the amygdala, we know, is the source of, it is essential for the ability to develop a normal fear response.
And I think you and I have had this discussion too. There's also the inability to recognize fear in others, right? How does that play out? Why does someone who can't really spot fear in someone else tend them toward psychopathic acts?
So this is, I think, some of the most interesting research that my students and I have been doing over the last couple of years. It's what we, I think, have discovered is that when you see or hear or think about somebody else who's experiencing fear, in order to understand the emotion that they're feeling, you have to sort of recreate or simulate that emotional state within your own brain. And we know the amygdala is essential for being able to experience fear yourselves. And so if you don't have a strong amygdala response, when you see or hear somebody else who's afraid, you can't recreate what that emotion is like, and you fundamentally can't understand what the other person is feeling. You can't sort of empathize at the very lowest level.
So that may not, the brakes that would stop a normal person from hurting that other person, those aren't there?
That's exactly right. Now, normally, if one of us saw somebody who was frightened by something we were saying or doing, our ability to simulate what that fear experience must be like would be enough to stop us from doing that thing. Yeah. And if you don't have the ability to do that, you just go right on ahead.
So the second time we had a long conversation, it was when I was writing a story for The Atlantic on when your child, they called it When Your Child is a Psychopath, which probably struck fear in the hearts of many, many readers. But it turns out that you can see the seeds of callous unemotional traits, the seeds of psychopathy fairly early, 3 or younger sometimes. Can you just explain what's going on? What do you see? You've worked with kids in your research. What have you seen when you've worked with kids? How does it present?
One of the most interesting things about the children we've worked with who have these psychopathic, or they're sometimes called callous unemotional traits, is that they don't really stand out. I always say that if I were to bring in all the kids that I've studied that have psychopathic traits and line them up mixed in with all the kids we've studied who are perfectly healthy, you'd never be able to pick who is who out of a lineup. There's nothing obviously different about them.
And why is that, brain-wise?
Well, because we think that their deficits are pretty specific. It's quite different than, for example, people who have serious cases of autism or schizophrenia, which are really brain-wide disorders. It seems to be that psychopathy results from problems that are much more localized, and it leaves most of the brain and most functions intact.
So you were bringing these kids in, I don't know, how old were they, 6, 7, 8 years old, something like that?
We brought in kids. We tried to bring in kids who were 8 was the bottom when I was at the NIH, and it turns out that when kids are callous and uncaring, meaning they don't care what you think or what you want, And they're only 8 years old, which is too young to be really strongly motivated by compensation. And you need them to lie perfectly still without moving more than 4 millimeters over the course of 45 minutes. It doesn't work well at all. And so we gave up trying to bring in 8-year-olds, and we started at 10. So we brought in kids between 10 and 17.
And what did you see? I mean, could you spot? You said it's global and it's hard to spot, but what did you see in these kids when a child has callous unemotional traits? How does that present?
When we're looking at their brain scans, when you're scanning people who are healthy, the typical thing that you see when you present them with somebody who's a fearful facial expression, somebody looking afraid, while they're in the brain imaging machine, the MRI, on average, people show a strong amygdala response to that, which again, we think may be this trying to simulate what emotional experience that person is having. And the children who had psychopathic traits, we didn't see any response there at all. On average, their response was completely flat, in fact, a little bit negative. And we also found that the less amygdala response they showed to the fearful expressions, the worse their aggression was. In particular, this instrumental aggression that people who are psychopathic are known for, which is goal-directed aggression. You're trying to get something, you want something, and you're trying to hurt somebody by doing it.
Did you see any behavior that troubled you from any of these kids?
Oh, luckily, not so much with us during the scans. I think we had one child steal some food out of the cafeteria on their way to get a scan. And another one of them was flirting so much with one of my graduate students that his mom joked that he should ask her to his prom. But that's not, other than being a little surprising, it's not terribly troubling. What was more serious was the stories they told us about what they do in their daily lives.
Like?
Some of the worst things I heard about were a child who found a fake grenade and threw it into the library in his local town, attempting to make everybody believe that the library was being attacked by terrorists. That was a bad bum. Another one ran a loan shark operation out of his bedroom and was charging. He was, I think, 13. He wasn't any taller than me. I'm only 5 feet tall. And he was charging high school students, big guys, like $1 a day interest. And if they didn't pay up, he would threaten them with fireworks and paintball guns. The absolute lack of the imperviousness to the consequences of what he was doing were really amazing.
That's amazing. So are all we're talking about psychopathy here, and you do think about Hannibal Lecter, but are all psychopaths violent?
Definitely not. Most of the kids that we worked with were violent, at least some of the time. They had abused animals. They were extremely aggressive at home and at school. They mostly had been kicked out of multiple schools, and their parents and families were living in fear of them. We had one boy whose parents would repeatedly take his siblings to a hotel to spend the night because they were so afraid he was going to burn the house down overnight. That said, there's nothing about being psychopathic that makes you intrinsically violent. Violence is used more as a tool to get what it is that you want. And so if violence is a useful tool to get what you want, then you might be violent. But especially some of the girls that we worked with, if you're a smallish female, violence is not actually a very effective tool to get anything. And so they would usually use other methods to try to get what it was they wanted.
And, when they grow up to be adults, there's this term that I've heard, successful psychopaths. Can you just tell, I think all of us would like to know, maybe we already know a successful psychopath.
I'm sure we can all think of some.
Yes. So what does that mean? What are successful psychopaths?
First of all, I love that term because it implies that they're successful at being a psychopath, and that's sort of a contradiction in terms. A successful psychopath is somebody who makes their way in the world and seems to sort of skirt just under the radar of blatantly illegal behavior. They may be a terrible person. Everybody around them may feel like they're deceitful and manipulative, but they're getting along in the world. Bernie Madoff is somebody whose name often comes up as somebody who may well have been a psychopath, even though, as far as I can tell, there was not a whole lot of violence in his background. What you're looking for to tell if somebody is seriously psychopathic, the core traits of psychopathy that even distinguish people who are psychopathic from other antisocial populations are this callous and remorseless temperament, where there's a persistent pattern of engaging in the kinds of behavior that cause people suffering, even people who are nominally close to you, and a failure to seemingly register that your behavior is causing other people to suffer, and a lack of any remorse after the fact. There's a constant tendency to blame behavior on some external factor. Well, I couldn't help it. They drove me to it. It wasn't my fault. Anybody would have done this in this situation.
Wow, That's scary.
Yeah, no, I mean, unfortunately, it happens a lot that people discover what it is I do. And I get the email that says, "Can I pick your brain about psychopaths, please?" I'm like, oh no, who did they discover in their life that it turns out has been stealing money from them or has been hurting people behind the scenes? It happens a lot. And the worst part is when they say, well, what can I do? Because there's not really anything you can do.
I
You
was
just
going to ask you.
stay away. Try to keep yourself from being vulnerable. There's no, I mean, for the average person who feels things like remorse and who really, like the idea of actually hurting another person makes you feel terrible, it's very hard to believe that there are people in the world who really don't feel terrible about hurting other people. They really don't, like not deep down, not anywhere. And it makes us, unfortunately, too willing to give people another try sometimes whose pattern of behavior shows that they really do not care. And it's useful to know that 1 or 2% of people in the world truly do not care about other people's welfare. And if you notice that persistent pattern of behavior in somebody, just steer clear.
That's
you can.
Yeah, that's hard to do if you're a parent, for example. And so when I was looking at the phenomenon of children with callous unemotional traits, parents were really hoping that they could do something to make their children better, and the thought was, gosh, if you get them early enough, you may be able to change you may be able to teach them empathy. I know we're really in early days on this research, but do you have any sense for whether people can actually change?
I think so. I think it's not like, I mean, if you think again of sort of the continuum of caring, you're not likely going to move anybody from the bottom end to the top end. But there's plenty of evidence that these are properties that are flexible and, what neuroscience researchers call plastic. They can change over the course of somebody's life. And some of the most recent evidence with children suggests that children who are at high risk for becoming psychopathic due to traits that they have been observed in their biological parents and that you see in them very early on, if they're raised by mothers who are unusually warm and responsive, not just sort of pretty warm and responsive, but at the very high end of the warmth and responsiveness scales, those children's risk for psychopathy drop a lot as they develop. And so I think there's every reason to believe that these are traits that can be improved and influenced, but we just have to do a lot more research than we've done so far to figure out how.
And the flip side of it is, how do you, if you want to be more altruistic, more generous, and you don't have, naturally that really large, active amygdala, can we become more altruistic?
We definitely can become more altruistic because we see these trends happening all around the world where altruism is becoming more and more common over time. So the only way that's possible is if people actually can become more altruistic. The best empirical evidence about increasing altruism is actually regarding compassion meditation or loving kindness meditation. There have been a number of pretty good studies at this point showing that these meditation practices, and not just any kind of meditation, there are many different kinds and they do different things, but in particular, these kinds of meditation seem to make people more likely to care about and behave altruistically towards strangers as time goes on. Other ways that seem to improve altruism are reading, especially reading literature. Seems like an appropriate place to mention that. There's this really interesting theory. It's put out there by a number of other psychologists, including Steven Pinker, that books are sort of this device for transporting us into the consciousnesses of strangers, of people that we've never met before, who may be very different from ourselves, and sort of feeling with them and thinking with them. And it's really just a form of practice. I mean, that's all compassion meditation is too. It's practicing, experiencing feelings of compassion for people progressively more distant from yourself. And reading seems to, in some ways, serve the same function, which may be why, as cultures get more prosperous and more literate, which always goes along with prosperity, people seem more practiced in thinking about the internal worlds of people that they've never met.
Oh, that's really interesting. Inappropriate.
Yeah.
So finally, my last question for you is, what's your view of, you've now studied psychopaths and you've now studied altruists. Has your research kind of changed the way you view human nature or the world?
Absolutely. And interestingly, it's actually the research I've done on psychopathy that makes me the most optimistic. Yeah, I know. People ask a lot, is it really depressing? Is it really hard studying children who have these traits? And it is, especially because working with their parents is really difficult because their parents don't really have very good options for what to do. But what it really has solidified for me is the fact that people who are psychopathic truly are selfish. They don't actually care about other people's welfare at all. The things that they do are for their own self-benefit, and that is unusual. Like, the whole reason that we bring them in, the whole reason that we study them is because that's not normal. That's not the way the average person is. And I think it's really solidified for me that the average person really does have the capacity to care for other people because they are not psychopaths.
Great. Well, I'm done with my questions, which means that you get a chance to ask Abby the questions that you have. And I think just going up to the microphone, I should have asked you a question. Does anyone? Yes, there we go.
Good evening.
Hey.
So my question was, so psychopaths hurt others. Do altruists hurt themselves to help others?
That's a great question. I mean, I suppose objectively they do, right? Volunteering to have your own kidney taken out of you certainly results in some physical damage to the person in order to help other people. But I wouldn't call them masochistic, right? It's not like they desire to hurt themselves to help other people. It's just that when the benefit for somebody else is so great, they don't mind if they have to be hurt somewhat in an effort to help somebody else. But they're not driven to hurt themselves, thank goodness. Oh, and that was actually one of the original fears. Donating a kidney to a stranger has only really been officially sort of legal for about 16 years. And psychiatrists were quoted as saying things like that it's morally repugnant and pathological to the deepest degree in previous years that anybody would want to give a stranger to a kidney. They just couldn't fathom that somebody would be willing to do something like that. They thought they must be masochistic or psychotic or something else like that, but it doesn't seem to be true.
How does the distribution between males and females among psychopaths skew? And if the females do not use violence because they're small, what are the skill sets that they bring to bear on their traits?
I love the phrase skill sets. I suppose you could call it that. So there are a lot of questions about the distributions of male and female psychopaths, partly because of historical accident, that the scale that's most often used to assess psychopathy is called the PCLR, the Psychopathy Checklist. And it was developed in males in a prison in Canada. And so there are some questions about whether the items on that scale are kind of an artifact of the fact that it was developed in men. And if the personality traits in men and women might be the same, it's just that they express themselves differently in terms of the behavior that you see. So for example, one of the items on that scale is things like multiple marital relationships. And that's not intrinsically psychopathic, it's just something that tends to be a downstream effect. And so it may be the case that women's psychopathy, which in general you see fewer women who are psychopathic than men, although not as many fewer as you might think. Maybe it may be that we're not picking up on them because they tend to use a lot more social manipulation, sort of bullying type behaviors in a social sense. Some of the children that I worked with, the adolescents, were also much more likely to use sexuality to get what they wanted, sort of whatever tools you have at your disposal.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you have worked with autistic children and if there are traits that are somewhat, at least look similar.
That's a great question. It's one of the problems with the term empathy is that it encompasses so many different things that sometimes people confuse children who are autistic with ones who are psychopathic because we, sometimes refer to children who are autistic as low in empathy. But in fact, autism is associated with a very different kind of empathy deficit, with deficits in what's called theory of mind, which is difficulty understanding other people's intentions and beliefs and thoughts, so sort of cold cognitive thoughts. But people who are autistic who do have difficulty with that kind of process don't have any difficulty with caring about other people once they register what it is that they're feeling. And so it may be that a person can have both autistic traits and psychopathic traits, but there's no inherent relationship between psychopathy and autism.
Can I just follow up? Isn't it actually the flip in the sense that the psychopathic person might have a clear sense of what the other person is thinking and feeling, and that's why they're so good at manipulating, but they don't care?
Yeah, this may actually be a key feature of a so-called successful psychopath, is that they have really good ability to understand what other people want and desire, and that's why they're so good at manipulating them and so good at deceiving them.
Hi, so I came in a little late. I don't know if you touched on this, but I was wondering, how can you be certain, like, regardless of the fact that psychology is science and there's no certainty necessarily, how can you be certain that altruists aren't doing what they do for the sake of, like, the gratification that they might feel, and they're actually doing it out of just, like, wanting to help others?
This is a really deep and incredibly important question. Like, why would somebody give a kidney to a stranger? Is it because of the gratification they receive afterward? And it's a hard question, in part because people who are altruistic do feel gratification after they donate to somebody else and they successfully save their life, if that is what ultimately happens. And the issue really is one of whether the behavior was motivated by the desire to experience gratification or whether that's just a foreseeable downstream consequence. And the reality seems to be that that's mostly just a foreseeable downstream consequence. You know, anytime you seek to do something and you accomplish it, you feel gratified by the fact that you accomplished what you wanted to do. It doesn't necessarily mean that's what motivated you. And having worked with people who were psychopathic, who desire only gratification, has really reinforced how people who just desire gratification don't go about it by giving away organs in general. There are many, many easier, quicker ways to just feel good and to feel good about yourself than to do something like that. But actually, many of the altruists that I've worked with have wrestled with this question. They feel that because they just feel like so gratified by what they did, they all say, like, I ask every single one of them, would you donate again if you had another kidney to give? And I get exactly the same answer from a huge proportion of them, which is in a heartbeat. Of course I would do it. Would give away 10 if I had 10 more kidneys to give. I'm so glad I did it. And they feel conflicted. They're like, maybe I did it just because I wanted to feel this good. And I try to reinforce for them that just because you feel good after the fact does not mean that feeling good was what motivated you.
Thank you for this very valuable work. What about psychopaths and sadism? Not just indifference, but delight in someone else's suffering?
That's a great question. So this sort of relates to the fact that most people who are psychopathic are not serial killers. Most of us have in our minds, you know, somebody like Ted Bundy, who in fact came from my hometown. In fact, he grew up about 3 miles from where I grew up. He is not by any means a prototypical psychopath. I mean, he was a psychopath, no doubt about it. But he was somebody who was psychopathic in the sense that he didn't care about other people's suffering, he didn't care about their welfare, and in addition, he was clearly a sadist, meaning he actively took pleasure in causing other people pain. Those two things are actually pretty different phenomena. The problem is when you get them both together, you end up with somebody like Ted Bundy.
Hi, Abby.
Hello.
How self-aware are altruists and psychopaths to their personalities?
Oh, this is a great question. I'm glad you asked that. My sense is it varies a little bit, but probably not completely. And there are really interesting examples of people who are psychopathic, and in fact, I think Ted Bundy is one, who have been quoted as saying things like they believed that they were the same as everybody else, that actually everybody else was just play acting. When they acted like they cared about other people, they were really just pretending, and some people just do it a little bit better than others. The altruists that I've worked with, we were really stumped at first. We would start asking them questions like, do you think that you are a more compassionate person than average? Are you more altruistic than average? And they usually will say no. And I would say, well, that's so interesting because it certainly appeals from the outside like you are doing these extraordinarily altruistic things. And they say, but it doesn't feel extraordinary to me. It feels like when you hear that somebody's going to die without a kidney and you have a kidney to give, why wouldn't you give a kidney? It just seems like the obvious thing to do. And to them, not giving a kidney in that circumstance is the thing that needs explaining. They assume that almost anybody would give a kidney to a stranger if only they had the right information. Which I think is a really sort of amazing, once we realized that was true, I was really sort of amazed by it. So I don't think that they're necessarily fully realized the gap. And I don't think any of us do. I think most of us assume that everybody else is mostly like us, which is why people who engage in really extreme behaviors are so surprising.
Hey, Abby. My question is, I don't know if you measured this, but in what percentage of the population that you worked with that were altruistic actually maintained a connection with the people who they were altruistic towards? And also any big surprises in your research that you conducted? What was the most surprising thing to you?
Of the people who have donated a kidney to a stranger, most of the ones that we've studied are what's called non-directed donors, meaning that they didn't know who their kidney would go to before they donated, which also meant that they might never meet that person. It would be up to the recipient to decide whether or not they wanted to meet their donor. And again, we all think that whatever we would want to do is what everybody would want to do, but it's not true. I think some recipients are really conflicted about the fact that somebody they'd never met before was willing to do this thing to save them. And so a number of altruistic kidney donors never do meet their recipient. It's clear that they all would like to, just to see the life and the health that they've restored this person to. What I've heard that's amazing is how quickly people who are at death's door when they've been on dialysis for a while are restored to health, perfect health, almost instantly after the kidney donation. It starts producing urine, and the person, it has a beautiful color again, and they feel good again right away. While unfortunately, the altruistic kidney donor now feels terrible because they started out feeling great, and now they feel awful for several days, usually after the surgery. And then among the ones who actually do end up meeting their recipients, it's a mix. I would say some of them end up meeting their recipient and forming a really close bond with them. Others of them end up meeting them and are really happy that they've met them, but there's no real relationship afterward. It's an interesting mix. And I would say probably the most surprising thing about them is what I was referring to a minute ago, which is how they don't experience the decisions they've made as anything particularly interesting. In fact, one of them, in the middle of the interview, when we asked him, are you an extraordinarily altruistic person? Are you unusual? He's like, I'm sitting on this couch. You flew me here from, St. John's is where he was from. And I guess I must be if you flew me all the way here to scan my brain. But he really had never thought that there was anything particularly unusual about him up until that moment.
So my question is about the prevalence, I guess is the word, of altruism in different population categories, such as if I'm a child of someone who has done an altruistic act, am I likely to catch that from my parents? Political parties, Democrats, Republicans, a believer in God, non-believers, or even cultures, do you have any data across those categories?
We have a little indirect data. Interestingly, the data that we have suggests there's not a super strong relationship to political orientation. You can care about other people regardless of your political orientation, which I think is actually something I'm really glad is true. The last thing we need is even more polarization. It's clearly true that there are relationships between compassion and altruism among people who are related. The estimates seem to converge around the idea that about half of the variation in pretty much any personality trait you could pick is due to genetic factors. Half, certainly not 100%. And so when there are relationships between things like altruism or psychopathy within a family, it's always hard to know for sure if that's a shared genetic effect or if that's something about the way that they were raised. I will say that there's no obvious anything that parents do to cause their children to become more altruistic, especially to become extraordinarily altruistic. Because we do ask all the altruists that we bring in, is there, are your siblings like you, for example? And very few of them say that they are, which suggests that it wasn't just something simple that parents were doing. That said, I do come back to the idea that the more you can practice thinking about the internal worlds of the people around you, whether that's by reading literature, whether that's by doing compassion meditation, whether that's by going out and volunteering and engaging in various kinds of altruistic behavior in your community, which I think helps people kind of build up to more and more altruism. I think those are all valuable ways of stepping up.
And believers versus non-believers?
Nothing that I've seen is a really strong correlation. We have an incredible mix of different religious backgrounds, everything from having no religious faith at all to, I think we've had at least a couple of, every religious faith you can imagine among our population. We haven't found any relationship at all.
Okay, thank you.
Then I'm going to ask you one other question that I meant to ask you anyway. Do psychopaths have higher IQs?
Probably not. So probably what they have is average IQs. And what is unusual about that is that, especially if you're looking at criminal populations, on average, if you look at populations of people who are in prison, their IQs tend to be lower than average for a whole variety of different reasons. And so that is a little bit unusual about people who are psychopathic, is that their IQs tend to be no different than average. In addition, there seems to be a relationship between IQ and the severity of the behavior that you see, especially in children. So children who have very high IQs and are psychopathic have all sorts of tools to get into a huge amount of trouble because they are so cognitively capable.
Would you go to the microphone? Thank you.
Have you found more psychopaths in prison population, or what's the prevalence of psychopaths in prisons population?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of research done on this. The estimate is that about 50% of all violent offenders are psychopathic, meaning that they get a score of at least 30 on this 40-point psychopathy scale. Among all prison populations, it's probably somewhere around 20 or 25%. So not even a majority, but certainly a lot higher than it is in the general population.
What is the next frontier for altruism research?
Well, it would be really nice to have a better handle on how it is exactly, like what are the mechanisms by which the capacity for care expands outward from one's innermost circle to people who are progressively more distantly related. I think that's the challenge of our time, and it's something that actually my students and I are working on now.
Do you have any stories that just that you have to tell, whether it's relating, famous stories like the Scott Peterson story, or are there, excuse me, I should have done this, any stories that you just have to tell that you found particularly, as one person said, surprising, or something that explains the world to us a little bit?
Well, I suppose, I think the Scott Peterson example is a really interesting one that you bring up. I don't know if people remember Scott Peterson. He was a man who lived in California, and it must have been 15 or 20 years ago now. He started having an affair, and he ended up murdering his pregnant wife and dumping her body into San Francisco Bay. And it was really astonishing to people who knew him. It was one of those classic examples of everybody who knew him said, he seemed like such an ordinary guy. And I think it's a really good example of how how difficult it is to really know people, and how not everybody has the privilege that I do of getting to really sit down with people, interrogate them about their lives, try to understand what they're really like, look at their brain, measure their behavior in a lab, and really try to make them tick. But it's given me a great sense of humility about how when you only have a little bit of information about somebody out there in the world, how really difficult it is to understand what it is that's making them tick. And because I've done so much research now that suggests that the average person actually is a pretty caring person, I think it's made me a little bit more tolerant of most people's behavior, that you don't really know what's causing anybody to behave the way they are, but probably they're not doing it out of malice.
So is an altruist who has can change from altruist to non-altruist when somebody really behaves badly with him over a long, or whatever, he's discriminated against, people at work are nasty with him and so on?
Yeah, it's really important to emphasize that altruists are not suckers. They're not people who will just sit there and take it if people are being cruel to them or being unfair to them. And in fact, we did one study in the lab that shows that in the face of inequity, people who are altruistic are perfectly willing to retaliate. And so it seems like that's a totally different phenomenon than altruism. And it's one of the reasons that people who are altruistic hate being called saints. They're like, I think I just flicked off somebody in traffic when I was really mad the other day. Like, I'm not a saint. And it's true. What they really are is sensitive to when other people are suffering, sensitive to when other people are in distress. That really moves them profoundly, probably as a result of some of the brain phenomena that we've been studying. And in almost any other social milieu or social situation, they're probably just an ordinary person.
Any last takers? Do you mind? Yes, sorry. Oh, well, I can report it. She wants a little bit more on the Scott Peterson story.
Oh, a little bit more about Scott Peterson. Yeah. So, just in brief, he was an ordinary guy who, as far as we could tell, there was a biography of him. It wasn't a great biography. One day he up and murdered his wife and dumped her body in San Francisco Bay. Initially, nobody knew it was him who did it because he seemed to be out leading the charge to find the killer. He was having press conferences and organizing neighborhood searches to look for her body all over the neighborhood when in fact he knew exactly where her body was and it wasn't in the neighborhood. And later the investigators pieced together that the reason he had done this is because he'd been having an affair. And so what that suggests is that he was probably a good example of a successful psychopath. He was somebody who had this callous personality all along. It didn't bother him to do this terrible thing. But because he wasn't a sadist, he didn't go out of his way to hurt people. He hadn't been engaging in crime all throughout his life. And he probably had pretty good sort of frontally mediated regulation. But because he seemed to have this really callous temperament, and the things he did after he was arrested bore this out. He did a lot of classically psychopathic stuff, like try to develop a new identity and skirt across the border to Mexico and some other things. But it seemed like because he had this incredibly callous temperament inside, it didn't bother him to do this thing when the opportunity arose. So if the I don't know if I want to say need, but the desire to hurt his wife had never arisen because of this affair he was having, he might never have done anything terrible to anybody. But because he wanted to do it for this other reason, it didn't bother him to do this terrible thing that he did.
Hi, Abby.
Hi.
Thanks. I wanted to ask if writing this book had changed the way you're approaching your life in other ways besides optimism, like have you started reading more novels? Have you started you thought about donating a kidney? Can you just talk a little bit about how it's changed your day-to-day life?
Well, I do think it's made me, again, appreciate other people more than I used to. I really, having the enormous privilege of working with the altruistic kidney donors, who really are just wonderful people. It's been just such a pleasure to get to work with them, has made me, I think, it's expanded my horizons when I think about human nature in general. I have not decided that I want to donate a kidney, I hasten to say. I think that it's probably a good thing because I think it helps me stay objective. And it's also given me a little sense of humility that I am probably not at the end of the compassion spectrum, right? I think I'm probably pretty much in the middle. Like I do some nice things for other people like everybody does. And I think that makes me a pretty ordinary person. But maybe that makes me appreciate the extraordinary ones even more.
Actually, I wonder, does the act of becoming a parent, does that change you neurologically or chemically or in any way, kind of neurochemically, to make you more altruistic?
So it may. We don't have great data on this, but there are some really good brain imaging studies out there from just the last couple years suggesting that parenting does change your brain, and not just in ways that make you more forgetful and scattered. We all knew that. But there may be an extent to which the flood of hormones like oxytocin, which is a hormone that I study, that occur after you have a child do result in sort of semi-permanent changes to your brain. We know this happens in rats. Rats are, again, this fascinating species where they are heartless and cruel to rat pups before they have their own babies. And then something about the experience of becoming mothers for the first time causes mother rats to experience this rapid transformation in the way that they treat babies and the kind of altruism they will show for them. They will literally walk across an electrified grid to get babies out of danger once they have become mothers. It's a really astonishing change, and it is basically permanent. And so there is a possibility.
Do male rats change when they become fathers?
They do not. So I shouldn't. Actually, male rats do. Their behavior does change. What's interesting is that the other way that you can change mother rats, one way is giving them oxytocin. So inject oxytocin into their brains, they will become more caring very quickly. Or have them have their own babies, which causes this oxytocin cascade. But the other way is just force them to be around babies. Just be like, no, you can't leave. I know you've got better things to do. I know there's some food over there. You can't leave. You have to stay around these babies. Please don't eat them, which sometimes they do. And after a couple days, all that maternal care process will start to kick in. So the act of caring for others seems to rev up the caring system in a way that causes more care to happen. It's sort of this beautiful self-perpetuating cycle. And there's some evidence that that's true in people as well. And many of the altruists we've worked with say that they started by donating blood, and that was a good experience. And so they moved up to marrow, and now they've donated a kidney, and some of them are now thinking of donating a piece of their liver. And at some point, I start to feel like, it's okay. Like, you don't have to keep donating organs. But I do think there's a sense that care begets more care. And so in that way, having babies may do exactly something like that.
I think there's a man right ahead.
Hi. You've talked about sort of the impact of reading, and especially literature. And there's lots of news articles these days on the potential impacts of screen time and social media. And I'm wondering if you or anyone has looked at sort of what that is doing to altruism in our culture.
That's a great question. Yes, so the question is, how is social media and our use of social media and screen time affecting altruism and related phenomena? This, as you might imagine, it's not only a new question, it's a question that's very hotly debated. And there's some evidence on both sides. It's clear that social media, Twitter's a good example, there's some good data from Twitter users about what it really seems to do is polarize people. People, and this is not news, obviously, we tend to be most likely to correspond with people who are like us, who are already part of our network, who agree with us. Unfortunately, there's also evidence that the emotion that seems to propagate the best through social media networks is rage. When people are posting something about that makes them feel sad, or that makes them feel joyful, that makes them feel disgusted, or makes them feel afraid, none of that tends to burst through a network the way that something that makes you feel outraged does. And I'm sure we've all had this example of, that's outrageous, share, and it's very easy to do. And unfortunately, rage is an emotion that can block the capacity for care, even in people who are perfectly capable of caring. And this is really the much bigger problem for most people. It's not, are you capable of caring? It's that, are you engaging in care even when you are capable of it? And there's also evidence that, for example, people who are experienced as through their text are not humanized as fully as people whose voices we can hear. When we can hear somebody talking, we experience them as being a human being with an internal life. And at least on social media, which is not literature, usually, we don't get that same sort of emotional richness that causes us to really humanize another person. And it may be one of the reasons we see some of the effects that we do. That said, social media usage is increasing, and altruism for strangers also continues to increase. So I don't think it's a purely negative phenomenon. I think it's complex in ways we don't fully understand.
This is going to be our last question.
Speaking of eating baby rats.
I speak about that a lot.
Ding, ding, ding. It made me think, what are these personality traits like as parents, in particular psychopaths?
So what are psychopaths like as parents?
Yeah.
Oh, so actually some colleagues of mine and I, we were at the biannual conference for psychopathy researchers this past summer. All of us were there. And we were talking about how little research has been done on psychopathic traits in parents. And how becoming a parent affects psychopathic traits, and how people with psychopathic traits respond as parents. We have only the most sort of preliminary anecdotal evidence. My guess would be that people who are psychopathic themselves are not the most warm and responsive parents. There's no evidence that they would be. And so probably what this results in is children end up with kind of a double whammy, where they have inherited risk factors, and then if they're raised by people who are themselves psychopathic, now they've also got risk factors as a result of their environment, which amplifies the effects of whatever their early risks were. But there's a surprisingly little amount of data on this.
Let's give Abby a generous as opposed to a psychopathic applause.
Thank you.